Last Sunday, Mitch mentioned something in his sermon that I really thought was an important point. He mentioned that we should never think in terms of the secular world and the religious world, or that we are somehow in a religious community set apart from the world and should never think about secular things, because all things belong to God. That was a foundational principle of John Calvin, who was our founder. All of life belongs to God. And I can't help but think that God has been speaking to me the last couple of days through the most obscure way. Last night I went to bed and turned on the television only to find How the Grinch Stole Christmas on the TV. And then this morning, as Mitch and I were driving to the church, we turned on the radio, and the first song we heard was, "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch." And then I thought that was enough. Went over to pick up my mother and come to worship between services. And what comes on the radio? But you're a mean one, Mr. Grinch. It won't leave me alone. So apparently God is saying, keep focused on the sermon today, Sue. And what an obscure sermon. Now this morning, I had some questions for the congregation about the story. I'm going to grab my list of questions so I don't forget them. And I was going to come around with my microphone and ask everybody to speak, and everyone was so excited that they all spoke together. So I'm going to assume the same. So if you know an answer, you can shout it out. But I want to tell the story of the Grinch together. And it begins with the Grinch. So I'm looking for adjectives. So, all right, English teachers and all you English lovers, how about some adjectives for the Grinch? How would you define him? Stingy. Mean. Nasty. Selfish. Green. I love that one. All of those things. You got him. The Grinch is a miserable human being, right? A difficult person. He lives in a what? Cave. This is not a wine cave. This is a despicable kind of cave that is dark and dingy, where he plots all of his nasty little things he's going to do. And that cave is hiding inside of Mount Crumpet. Somebody remembered. Thank you, Julie. Mount Crumpet. And you can cheat on this one. I realized this when I looked at the sermon title. And how many sizes too small is his heart? 2. So down below this steep, high mountain where he lives is the town of? Right. Home of the merry and warm-hearted Whos, who are preparing for the Christmas celebration. And his only companion, this mean old Grinch, is his unloved but extremely loyal dog named Max. So from his cave, the Grinch can hear all of the noise of the festivities happening below. And he is so miserable. He's a horrible creature. And he can't stand the idea that these people are happy and cheerful. And so he decides, because he hates the Whos, and he blames them for making his life miserable, he's going to stop Christmas from coming for them. He's going to go down in the dark of night and steal their presents and trees and food, even the food for their Christmas feast. He even takes the delicious roast. The Grinch then takes his sleigh, all loaded with loot, to the top of Mount Crumpet, and he prepares to dump it. And as dawn breaks, he expects to hear the Whos' bitter and sorrowful cries.
And the Grinch, with his Grinch feet, ice cold in the snow, stood puzzling and puzzling. How could it be so? It came without ribbons. It came without tags. It came without packages, boxes, or bags. He puzzled and puzzled till his puzzler was sore. Then the Grinch thought of something he hadn't before. Maybe Christmas, he thought, doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas, perhaps, means a little bit more.
And then, in the words of Theodore Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss, he wrote, "What happened then? Well, in Whoville, they say, the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day. And then the true meaning of Christmas came through, and the Grinch found the strength of 10 Grinches plus 2. I love how that moment of revelation for the Grinch turns his eyes from red to blue in the cartoon. This new reformed Grinch returns all of the Who's presents, all of the trimmings, and the people of Whoville, being the very forgiving people that they are, welcome the Grinch back into their community. He's warmly invited to celebrate the Who's feast. He even has the honor of carving the... Yeah, you know this story so well. It's really a wonderful story about someone learning the lesson of love at Christmas time, and then having the opportunity to not only learn the lesson for himself, but see it lived out in the lives of the Who's. Really, if you think about it, it's a story that fits very well with our Christian Christmas story. As Christians, we know, or at least I hope we all know, that we're supposed to be loving everyone. But we also know it's not always easy. But I do believe that with some emotional intentionality, it can be done. So if you're one of those people who can love everyone, I want you to know that you are a Christmas gift. And I hope that you will model that for all of us. I want to share with you some insights from a woman who is a Methodist pastor and a church consultant, which means she works with congregation on areas of growth and revitalization. Her name is Rebecca Simon Peter, which is where I want to stop for a moment and have a Grinch moment. Who gets a name Simon Peter? I think of this often. Mitch and I went to a guy whose name was Michael Pentecost. We have a colleague in ministry named Alan Presby. There are people named Church with their last names. So what do we have? Trigger. The name of the movie about gun violence for the Presbyterian Church. All right, that's my Grinch moment. Anyway, so Rebecca Simon Peter, with her lovely, lovely name, says that we need to remember that we are all called to love everyone. But we shouldn't worry if we don't. We can't expect to like everyone. And she reminds us that like and love are not the same thing. In fact, she says liking everyone, especially in church, is really a bad sign. She even goes so far as to say that if you like everyone in your church, it's an indication that your church may be in decline. Yeah, think about that for a minute. She says that if you like everyone, you probably have one of 4 situations happening in your congregation. So here are the 4. Listen carefully and see if one of these connects with you. Number 1, you're not paying attention. Number 2, you've recently been unexpectedly snatched from the jaws of death, and all of life is joyous, and nobody, not anybody, could rain on your parade. Number 3, you're not telling the truth. You are a caring and kind person, but deep down inside, there are certain people in the congregation who bother you, maybe even a lot. And number 4, everyone at your church is just like you, with few exceptions. Fellow church members who look like you, sound like you, think like you, believe like you, process like you, dress and talk like you. And so what's not to like? So if you answered number 1, according to Rebecca Simon Peter, she says, wake up! Life is passing you by, the good and the bad. If you answered number 2, she says, enjoy it while it lasts, because this too shall pass. Number 3, remember, is you're not telling the truth. And she says, if that is the answer, breathe a sigh of relief. Being bothered by others is actually a good sign. It means that there's a certain amount of diversity in your church community. Perhaps it's generational, it could be theological, heaven forbid it be political or cultural, or maybe it's simply that the person that you really don't like leads with their head and you lead with your heart, or they like to jump into things and talk incessantly while you like to take your time and take your own counsel. Or diversity can be anything annoying in the short term, but it's vital for long-term sustainability. Simon Peter makes the case that we need these differences, even if we don't like them. Healthy DNA, robust ecosystems, and strong economies all depend on diversity. Now, if you answered number 4, which was everyone at the church looks like you, we should get together and talk sometime. While this is, on the surface, very positive feeling, it actually is something that can bring a curious kind of trouble to a church. Too much harmony isn't actually desirable. It means that there's not enough diversity in the church. More specifically, it probably means that there's a lack of daring, a lack of risk-taking or adventure, a lack of visionary thinking. Overly emotional or off-the-wall people are not in your church. And so the qualities that you would find would be stability, dependability, and predictability. And those would be the rule of the day. They sound so desirable, but the truth is we need all of these qualities in our church. While liking everyone harmony keeps the annoyance factor at bay, it also means that you're missing out on new ways of thinking, new ways of sensing and understanding, an openness even to listening to where God may be leading us. And in this day and age, when the world around us is constantly changing, we really do need the ability to be nimble, flexible. Otherwise, we'll never try new things. The healthiest churches, according to Rebecca Simon Peter, have a variety of personalities and preferences. And when guided by a strong kingdom-oriented vision with lots of commitment, different personalities and preferences working together can unleash a tremendous momentum for good. It's an important thing for us to think about. It was true for Jesus, too. In our scripture lesson this morning, we get the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, and the disciples get their first glimpse into who Jesus is going to be. And they find out immediately that he's not going to be your regular kind of Messiah. He's turning water into wine, and he's calling together this very interesting group of followers. It's more than likely that not all of the disciples really liked each other. There was an interesting blend of those who were quiet and those who were headstrong, those who stepped out of the boat to walk on the water, and those whose faith was smaller than a mustard seed. There were fishermen and scholars, tax collectors and the heavily taxed, siblings in a competition for who was going to sit at the right hand of God. There were Pharisees and zealots. And because of this variety of gifts that they brought to the table, the movement survived. I imagine that in time they grew to love each other. But I've read the Bible. I doubt that they all liked each other. But imagine what it would be like if it were the opposite. If all of the disciples were clones of Peter with his blustery, impetuous personality, or if they were all like Mary or Martha, who were constantly wrestling with how to be in the presence of Jesus. Or what if they were all like Bartholomew? What would we know about Jesus? Jesus knew the diversity was important, and he practiced it. So what about us? What makes it possible for a community to live in harmony, whether it's a congregation or a society, isn't liking each other. It's about loving each other. That's the source of the golden rule, really, if you think about it, that teaching that Jesus gave us, that you should treat people in the same way that you want people to treat you. It's the teaching of the law and the prophets. Rebecca Simon Peter wrote, Jesus, above all else, was about love. The love of God, love of people, love of self, and love of the unlovable. And if we give up on love, we might as well give up on being Christian. It just doesn't work. Sadly, we all have our Grinchy moments. We have all been hurt by someone, and often our response to that hurt is to become cynical or impatient, judgmental or angry, maybe even jealous. We respond to that internal pain by lashing out at others. Like the Grinch, we plot our revenge. We stand on our own Mount Crumpet and we look down at those who annoy us. And we get so caught up in our feelings that we forget the feelings of others. We forget to look for God's love, which is alive even in the midst of the ugliness. The Grinch saw that kind of love in Whoville on that Christmas day. And it wasn't just in the way that the Whos reacted to the loss of their presents, which was quite impressive, but in the way that they treated the Grinch after they knew it was he who had stolen their presents and then returned them. They welcomed him into the community. They forgave him for his crimes. They treated him as if he was the most special guest they had ever met. They loved him just as he was. I once saw a saying about love that stuck with me that goes like this: love is not if or because. Love is anyway and even though and in spite of. But I would add one more phrase: love is just as you are. It's unconditional. It's willing to forgive. It's welcoming of diversity and patient with division. Love is not easy, but it is the source of life. And when we get it right, we find God, for God is love. Love truly is the greatest gift that we have ever received. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believes in him will not perish but will have eternal life. That's some kind of love, isn't it? Love is what spurred God into creating the galaxies. Love is why God invited an imperfect creation into a perfect relationship. Love came down at Christmas. A tiny child who would bring God's salvation to the world, packaged in love. It seems the least that we could do in return is to try to learn to love like that too. I mean, what if the whole world learned to love the way that Jesus taught us to? Can you imagine a better present for us? Can you imagine a better present for God? Imagine how your heart would grow 3 sizes that day. May it be so. Amen.